I came to Red Mesa as a mail-order bride. Instead, I became a mother to a dying boy and an enemy to a monster who called himself family. What happens when you step off a train into hell itself, expecting love but finding only dust, desperation, and a child's whispered plea that will change everything? This is the story of how one woman's journey west became a fight for an innocent life under the merciless summer sun, and how sometimes the family we choose is worth more than the one we're promised. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the scorching afternoon like a knife through butter, announcing its arrival at Red Mesa Station with a shriek that seemed to protest the very existence of this godforsaken outpost. Marianne Locke pressed her gloved hand against the window, feeling the glass burn hot even through the fabric, and watched as the platform materialized through waves of heat that made the whole world shimmer like a cruel mirage. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the 3-day journey from Philadelphia. In her mind, it had always been romantic somehow, stepping down into a new life, into the arms of a man who had written her such tender letters, his words promising companionship and respect, if not love. Thomas Garrett had seemed kind on paper, thoughtful in his descriptions of life on his ranch, honest about the hardships but optimistic about their future together. The reality was something else entirely. Red Mesa Station wasn't a station at all. Not really. It was a wooden platform that looked like it might collapse under the weight of too much hope, a single bench that had been bleached white by countless summers, and a faded sign that announced the town's name in letters so worn they were barely legible. Beyond the platform, the town itself was little more than a collection of sun-beaten buildings that seemed to crouch against the earth, trying to escape the relentless assault of the sun. Marianne gathered her small suitcase. Everything she owned in the world fit into that battered leather case, and made her way to the door. The other passengers, mostly men heading to the mining camps further west, pushed past her with barely a glance. She was used to being invisible. 28 years old and unmarried, she had become a ghost in her sister's Philadelphia home. A burden that was never spoken of, but always felt. "You're doing the right thing," her sister had said when Marianne announced her intention to answer Thomas Garrett's advertisement. But her eyes had said something different. They had said, "Thank God you're finally leaving." The conductor, a weathered man with kind eyes and a face like tanned leather, offered his hand as she stepped down. "You sure about this, miss? Red Mesa ain't much of a place for a lady on her own." "I won't be on my own," Marianne said, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "Mr. Garrett will be here to meet me." The conductor's expression suggested he'd heard that kind of optimism before and knew how it usually ended, but he tipped his hat and said nothing more. The train lurched forward with a great hiss of steam, and then Marianne was alone on the platform, her suitcase at her feet, the sun beating down on her dark traveling dress like a physical weight. She scanned the empty street, looking for a wagon, a horse, a man approaching with recognition in his eyes. But there was nothing, just heat and dust and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the listless town. The air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolence, and Marianne felt sweat beginning to trickle down her spine beneath her corset. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The platform offered no shade, and Marianne felt her face growing hot beneath her bonnet. She had brought water, but it was already warm, tasting of metal and desperation when she sipped it. "He's been delayed," she told herself. A ranch emergency. A sick animal. Something perfectly reasonable, but the knot in her stomach suggested otherwise. In her reticule, she carried 6 months' worth of letters from Thomas Garrett, each one more persuasive than the last. He had sent a tintype photograph, a serious-looking man with honest eyes and a strong jaw. He had sent money for her train ticket. He had written about his son, Eli, who needed a mother's touch after losing his own to fever 3 years ago. Everything had seemed so certain, so carefully arranged. And now, standing on this burning platform in the middle of nowhere, Marianne felt the first cold fingers of fear creeping up her spine, despite the oppressive heat. 20 minutes. 30. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature seemed to rise with every passing moment. Marianne moved her suitcase to the bench and sat down, trying to appear composed even though panic was beginning to flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. A few townspeople passed on the street, a woman with a basket, 2 men on horseback, but no one approached her. No one seemed to find anything unusual about a strange woman sitting alone at the station in the middle of a summer afternoon. She was just about to gather her courage and walk into town to make inquiries when she felt it, a tug at her skirt, so light she almost thought she'd imagined it. Marianne looked down and felt her heart stop. A boy stood beside the bench, so thin he seemed almost transparent in the harsh sunlight. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with hair so bleached by the sun it was nearly white, and skin that was sunburned and peeling across his nose and cheeks. His clothes, a shirt that was too large and pants held up with rope, hung on his frame like a scarecrow's rags. But it was his eyes that froze Marianne in place. They were enormous in his gaunt face, dark and desperate, and filled with something that looked terrifyingly like hope. "Mama?" he whispered, and the words seemed to take all his strength. Marianne's mouth went dry. I'm not—" But the boy swayed on his feet, and she saw that his lips were cracked and bleeding, his hands trembling as they clutched at her skirt. He wasn't asking a question. He was stating a prayer, a desperate belief that somehow, against all odds, salvation had arrived on the afternoon train. "You're her," the boy said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind picking up dust devils in the street. "You're the lady from back east. You're supposed to—" He stopped, swaying again, and Marianne instinctively reached out to steady him. His arm was burning hot under her hand, and she could feel the bones through his skin. This child was starving. This child was sick. This child was dying. "What's your name?" Marianne asked, kneeling down despite the heat radiating from the wooden platform, despite the way her dress immediately began to absorb the dust. "Where are your parents?" "Eli," the boy whispered. "I'm Eli Garrett." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Garrett, Thomas Garrett's son. "Where's your father?" Marianne asked, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew. She could see the answer in the boy's eyes, in the way his whole body seemed to sag as if the question itself was too heavy to bear. "Pa's dead," Eli said simply. "Got kicked by a horse 3 weeks ago. Hit his head. Uncle Garrick said he died instant, but I don't know if that's true. Uncle Garrick lies about most things." Marianne felt the platform beneath her knees, felt the sun on her back, felt the boy's burning skin under her hand. But none of it seemed real. She had come all this way. She had left everything behind. And the man who had promised her a new life was already in the ground. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I'm so sorry." "Are you staying?" Eli asked. And now his eyes were filling with tears that he was clearly too exhausted to fight. "Pa said you were coming to be my new mama. He said you were kind. He said things would be better when you got here." Marianne opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could she say? That she had no money for a return ticket? That she had no home to return to? That she was as stranded here as he was? "Uncle Garrick said you probably wouldn't come," Eli continued, and his words tumbled out faster now, as if he was afraid she would disappear if he didn't say everything quickly enough. "He said no lady from Philadelphia would really come out here. He said Pa was a fool for thinking someone like you would want someone like us. But I waited anyway. I waited every day at the station, even when Uncle Garrick said I was being stupid. I knew you'd come. I knew it." The boy's faith was breaking Marianne's heart. She could feel it cracking inside her chest, could feel something fundamental shifting in a way she didn't quite understand yet. "Eli," she said carefully, "where's your uncle now? Does he know you're here?" The boy's face changed, and for the first time Marianne saw something other than hope and exhaustion in his expression. She saw fear. "He'll be mad I left," Eli whispered. "He said I had to stay and do my chores, but I knew the train was coming, and I thought if I could just find you, if I could just show you I was waiting." He broke off, and a tear rolled down his sunburned cheek, leaving a clean track through the dust. "Please don't make me go back there alone." Marianne felt something solidify in her chest, something hard and bright, and absolutely certain. She didn't know this boy. She would never meet his father. She had no legal right to be here, no claim on this child or this life. But she knew, with the kind of clarity that comes once or twice in a lifetime if you're lucky, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "But you need water, and you need to get out of this sun. Can you take me to your home, to your uncle's ranch?" Eli nodded, but he swayed again, and this time his knees buckled. Marianne caught him before he hit the ground, feeling how light he was, how fragile. The boy was barely conscious now, his eyes rolling back as his body finally gave up the fight it had been waging against heat and hunger and fear. "Help!" Marianne called, looking frantically around the empty station. "Someone help me!" But the street remained empty, the town indifferent to one more tragedy unfolding under the merciless sun. Marianne shifted the boy in her arms, feeling the heat of his fever through her dress, and made a decision. She couldn't carry both Eli and her suitcase, and the choice was easy. She left everything she owned sitting on that bench and started walking toward the town, the boy's dead weight in her arms, her heart pounding with fear and anger and a determination she hadn't known she possessed. The first building she reached had a faded sign that read General Store. Marianne shouldered the door open and stumbled inside, grateful for the relative coolness of the dim interior. "I need help," she said to the man behind the counter, middle-aged, balding, with suspicious eyes that took in her dust-covered dress and the unconscious child in her arms. "This boy needs water and a doctor." "That's Eli Garrett," the man said, not moving. "You one of Garrick Sloane's people?" "I'm no one's people," Marianne said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. "I'm Marianne Locke. I was supposed to marry Thomas Garrett. I just arrived on the train, and I found this child alone at the station, half dead from heat and thirst. Now are you going to help me, or are you going to stand there asking questions while he dies?" Something in her tone must have gotten through, because the storekeeper finally moved, grabbing a canteen from beneath the counter and coming around to where Marianne had laid Eli on a pile of burlap sacks. "Garrett's dead," the storekeeper said as he carefully dribbled water onto Eli's cracked lips. "Thought everyone knew that. Figured you'd have gotten word before you left Philadelphia." "I didn't," Marianne said, watching the boy's throat work as he unconsciously swallowed the water. "When did it happen?" 3 weeks back, give or take. Brother-in-law took over the ranch, Garrick Sloane. He's the boy's uncle, I guess, though there's some as says Sloane's got no business claiming kinship with decent folks." The storekeeper's expression made it clear he was one of those people. "Been working the boy like a mule, from what I hear. Ranch is about 5 miles out of town, East Road. Is there a doctor here?" "Doc Morrison's out at the mining camp, won't be back until Friday." The storekeeper looked at Eli with something that might have been pity. "Best you can do is get fluids in him and keep him cool, and maybe pray, if you're the praying type." Marianne wasn't sure what type she was anymore. 2 hours ago, she had been a mail-order bride with a carefully planned future. Now she was a stranger in a hostile town, kneeling beside a dying child, with no money and no prospects and no idea what came next. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she wasn't leaving this boy. "I need to rent a wagon," she said. "Can you help me with that?" The storekeeper looked at her for a long moment, and Marianne could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "I've got an old trap out back. Horse is sound enough. You'll need to leave a deposit." "I don't have any money yet," Marianne admitted, "but I can give you this." She pulled off her mother's gold locket, the only thing of value she owned, the only thing she had kept from her old life. "It's worth more than a day's wagon rental." The storekeeper took the locket, examined it, and nodded. "Reckon it is. But Miss Locke," he hesitated. "Garrick Sloane ain't the kind of man who takes kindly to interference. You go out to that ranch, start making claims on the boy, he's not going to just step aside, and there ain't no law in Red Mesa that's going to go up against him without good cause." "Then I'll have to give them good cause," Marianne said. It took another 15 minutes to get Eli settled in the back of the wagon with a blanket for cushioning and the storekeeper's canteen refilled with water. The boy was more conscious now, sipping water slowly while Marianne held his head up, but he was still burning with fever, still trembling even in the terrible heat. "How long have you been living with your uncle?" Marianne asked gently as she climbed up to the driver's seat. "Since Pa died," Eli said weakly from the back. "He came the day after the funeral, said the ranch was his now, and I had to earn my keep. I tried, ma'am. I tried real hard to do everything he wanted, but it's never enough. Nothing's ever enough for Uncle Garrick." Marianne felt rage building in her chest like a physical thing. "Did he hurt you, Eli?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Marianne snapped the reins, and the horse started forward, pulling them out of town and onto the east road. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon now, but the heat remained oppressive, turning the landscape into something that looked like a painting of hell. All red dirt and scrubby brush and endless, empty sky. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was not what Marianne had imagined from Thomas Garrett's letters. He had written about a modest but comfortable home, about good grazing land and a reliable spring. What Marianne saw was neglect and decay, a main house with peeling paint and a sagging porch, outbuildings that looked ready to collapse, and fences that were more gap than fence. The whole place had an air of violence about it, as if something fundamental had been broken here. As Marianne pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, a man emerged from the house. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty that seemed baked into every line. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, his eyes scanning Marianne with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Who the hell are you?" he called out, not bothering with pleasantries. Marianne climbed down from the wagon, her legs shaking but her voice steady. "I'm Marianne Locke. I was engaged to marry Thomas Garrett. I'm here to—" "Garrett's dead," the man said flatly. "No need for you here. Town's back the way you came." "I know he's dead," Marianne said, "and I'm not leaving, not without Eli." The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward. Marianne could see now that he was drunk, not falling down drunk, but enough to make his movements slightly unsteady, enough to add an extra edge of danger to his already threatening presence. "That boy's my nephew," he said. "My responsibility. And you got no claim here, lady. So you turn that wagon around and—" "Eli," Marianne called, not taking her eyes off the man who must be Garrick Sloane. "Is this your Uncle Garrick?" "Yes, ma'am," came the weak reply from the back of the wagon. "And has he been taking care of you the way an uncle should?" There was a pause, and then Eli's voice, barely audible. "No, ma'am." Garrick's face flushed red. "The boy's a liar and a lazy—" "The boy is half dead from neglect and abuse," Marianne interrupted, and her voice cut through his words like a blade. "I found him at the station, burning with fever, too weak to stand. If I hadn't gotten him water, he would have died on that platform. And from what I can see of this ranch, you've been too busy drinking away whatever Thomas left behind to care whether that child lives or dies." For a moment, Garrick just stared at her, and Marianne realized she had made a terrible miscalculation. She was alone on an isolated ranch with a violent drunk and a sick child, with no help and no weapon and no way to protect herself if this went wrong. Then Garrick smiled, and it was worse than his anger had been. "You've got spirit," he said. "I'll give you that. Garrett always did have decent taste in women, even if he was too much of a saint to properly enjoy them." He moved closer, and Marianne caught the smell of whiskey and sweat. "Tell you what, you want to stay and take care of the boy? Maybe that could work out. I could use a woman around here, and you're not bad to look at under all that dust. We could come to an arrangement." Marianne felt bile rise in her throat. "I would rather die." "That could probably be arranged too," Garrick said, still smiling. But then his expression shifted, became calculating. "Those letters Garrett sent you, you still got them?" Marianne's hand went automatically to her reticule, and Garrick's smile widened. "Thought so. See, those letters might be a problem. Garrett made certain promises in writing. Talked about leaving the ranch to you if he died before you got married, making sure you and the boy were provided for." Garrick spat into the dust. "Fool always was too soft, but legally speaking, those letters might give you some kind of claim, and I can't have that." He lunged forward, reaching for Marianne's reticule, but she stumbled backward, clutching it to her chest. Garrick followed, his hand closing around her wrist with bruising force. "Give me those letters," he snarled, all pretense of civility gone now. "Give them to me or I'll—" "Let go of her." The voice came from behind Garrick, quiet but absolutely lethal in its tone. Garrick froze, and Marianne felt his grip loosen just slightly. A man stood at the edge of the yard, one hand resting on the gun at his hip. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Unlike Garrick's threatening bulk, there was something coiled about this newcomer, something that suggested he was more dangerous in his stillness than Garrick could ever be in his rage. "Stay out of this, Drury," Garrick said, but Marianne heard the uncertainty in his voice. "This is family business." "She's not family," the man called Drury said, "and that means it's not family business. Now let go of her." For a moment, Marianne thought Garrick would refuse. She could feel the tension in his body, the desire to assert his dominance. But then, slowly, his fingers released her wrist. "This ain't over," Garrick said, but he was backing away now, moving toward the house. "That boy's mine by law, and so is this ranch. You can't prove otherwise." "Maybe," Drury said, "but maybe I can prove you've been neglecting a child in your care. Maybe I can prove you've been drinking away the ranch's profits while a 7-year-old boy starves. There are laws about that, Garrick, even out here." Garrick's face twisted with rage, but he said nothing more. He turned and stalked into the house, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Marianne stood there, shaking, her wrist throbbing where Garrick had grabbed her. The man called Drury holstered his gun and walked toward her, moving with an easy grace that seemed at odds with the violence that had just been hovering in the air. "You all right?" he asked, and up close Marianne could see that his eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds. "I think so," Marianne said, but her voice was trembling. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't—" "I know what would have happened," Drury said grimly. "Garrick's got a reputation in these parts. You're lucky I happened to be riding by." "Lucky," Marianne repeated, and suddenly she wanted to laugh or cry, or both. "Is that what this is?" Drury's expression softened slightly. "You're the woman from Philadelphia, the one Garrett sent for." It wasn't a question, but Marianne nodded anyway. "Marianne Locke, and you are?" "Weston Drury. I've got a ranch about 3 miles north of here. Garrett was a good man. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing." "It's not for nothing," Marianne said, and she looked back at the wagon where Eli had pulled himself up to watch what was happening. "That boy needs help. He needs protection, and She stopped, trying to find the words for what she felt, for the certainty that had taken root in her chest the moment Eli had looked up at her with his desperate, hopeful eyes. "I can't leave him here." Weston looked at her for a long moment, and Marianne had the sense that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. Finally, he nodded. "You're right, you can't. But you also can't stay here tonight. Garrick's drunk and angry, and there's no telling what he'll do once the sun goes down." He glanced at the house, then back at her. "I've got a spare room at my place. You and the boy can stay there tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out what to do about Garrick and the ranch." Marianne wanted to refuse, wanted to prove that she could handle this on her own, but she was exhausted and terrified and completely out of her depth, and the thought of spending the night under the same roof as Garrick Sloane made her want to run screaming back to Philadelphia. "I don't want to impose," she said weakly. "It's not an imposition," Weston said. "It's common sense. Come on, let's get the boy into my wagon. That trap looks like it's about to fall apart anyway. You can return it to Morrison at the general store tomorrow." As Weston gently lifted Eli from the back of the wagon, Marianne took one last look at the ranch house. She could see a shadow at the window, Garrick watching them leave. The look on his face, even through the glass and the distance, promised that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as Weston settled Eli into his wagon and then helped Marianne up to the seat, as the horse started forward and the broken-down ranch fell away behind them, Marianne felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But something close to it. She had come west as a mail-order bride, expecting to start a new life according to someone else's plan. Instead, she had found a dying boy, and a dangerous enemy, and an unexpected ally. She had no idea what would happen next, no idea how she could possibly win against a man like Garrick Sloane, who had the law and custom on his side. But as the summer sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Marianne made herself a promise. She would find a way. She would protect Eli, no matter what it cost. She had crossed half a continent to start a new life, and she wasn't going to let a drunk bully take that away from her now. Beside her, Eli had fallen asleep against Weston's shoulder, his breathing still labored but steadier than before. And Weston himself sat silent and watchful, his hand steady on the reins, his profile sharp against the fading light. The frontier didn't forgive the helpless, Marianne thought. But maybe, just maybe, it rewarded the stubborn. And she was nothing if not stubborn. The road ahead was dusty and uncertain, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, at least, they would be safe. Tonight, they would rest and recover. And tomorrow, Tomorrow she would fight. Weston Drury's ranch appeared out of the darkening landscape like an answer to a prayer Marianne hadn't known she was saying. Unlike the decay that had consumed the Garrett place, this property showed signs of careful attention. Fences that actually stood straight, a barn with fresh paint, a house that looked lived in rather than merely occupied. The evening air had finally begun to cool, bringing with it the sweet smell of hay and something else, something Marianne couldn't quite identify, but that spoke of safety and order. "It's not much," Weston said as he pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch, "but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak." Marianne looked at the modest two-story house with its neat shutters and swept porch and thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd seen since leaving Philadelphia. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Weston carried Eli inside while Marianne followed, her legs stiff from the ride and her whole body aching with exhaustion she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. The interior of the house matched the exterior, simple but well kept, with sturdy furniture and floors that gleamed in the lamplight. There was a woman's touch here, Marianne noticed, in the curtains at the windows and the wildflowers in a jar on the table. "My mother's doing," Weston said, catching her look. "She passed 2 years ago, but I haven't had the heart to change much. She always said a house should feel like a home, not just a place to sleep between work days." He carried Eli up the narrow staircase, and Marianne followed him to a small bedroom that contained a single bed with a patchwork quilt and a window that looked out over the darkening prairie. Weston laid the boy down gently, and Eli's eyes fluttered open, confusion crossing his feverish face before recognition settled in. "Mr. Drury?" he whispered. "That's right, son. You're at my ranch now. You're safe here." "Uncle Garrick won't bother you tonight," Weston said firmly. "You have my word on that." Marianne moved to the bedside and placed her hand on Eli's forehead, still burning hot, but perhaps not quite as dangerously as before. "We need to get more water into him," she said, "and maybe some broth, if he can keep it down." "I'll heat some soup," Weston said. "There's a wash basin and pitcher on the dresser. Your room is across the hall, same setup. I'll bring up some fresh water and towels." After he left, Marianne sat on the edge of the bed and began the careful work of making Eli more comfortable. She removed his filthy, too-large shirt and found his ribs standing out sharply against his skin, his shoulder blades like small wings. There were bruises, too, old ones fading to yellow-green, newer ones still purple-black. Some were the size of a grown man's fingers. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed, and Eli's eyes opened again. "I'm sorry," he said automatically, and the reflex of that apology, instant and fearful, told Marianne more about his life with Garrick Sloane than words ever could. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Marianne said firmly. "Nothing that's happened is your fault. Do you understand me?" Eli looked at her with those enormous dark eyes, and Marianne saw that he didn't understand. Not really. He had been taught that everything was his fault, that he deserved whatever punishment came his way. Undoing that damage would take time, patience, and a strength Marianne wasn't sure she possessed. But she would try. God help her, she would try. Weston returned with water and towels and a set of what looked like a boy's nightshirt. "This was mine when I was about his age," he said, setting them on the dresser. "Might be a bit big, but it's clean." "Thank you," Marianne said. "Mr. Drury, Weston," he interrupted. "We're not exactly strangers anymore, Miss Locke, given the circumstances." "Marianne, then," she said, "and I need to ask you something. Why did you help us? You don't know me, and you could have just kept writing when you saw trouble at the Garrett Ranch. Why did you stop?" Weston was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes moving from Eli to Marianne and back again. "I knew Thomas Garrett. He was a good neighbor, a decent man. When he died, I rode over to pay my respects, to see if there was anything I could do for the boy. Garrick had already taken over by then, and he made it clear I wasn't welcome." His jaw tightened. "I should have pushed harder, should have found a way to check on Eli. But I told myself it was family business, that I had no right to interfere. Then I saw the boy in town a week ago, saw the bruises and the way he flinched when anyone came near him, and I knew I'd been a coward." "You're here now," Marianne said quietly. "Maybe too late." Not too late," Eli whispered from the bed, and both adults turned to look at him. "Pa said you were a good man, Mr. Drury. He said if anything ever happened to him, you'd look after things. But then Uncle Garrett came, and I didn't know how to find you. And I thought maybe Pa was wrong. Maybe there wasn't anybody." His voice broke, and tears began sliding down his sunburned cheeks. Weston crossed to the bed and took the boy's hand. "Your pa wasn't wrong, Eli. I'm sorry I let you down. But I'm here now, and so is Miss Mary Ann, and we're going to figure this out. I promise you that." It was a reckless promise, Mary Ann thought. They had no legal standing, no real plan, no guarantee that anything they did would make a difference. But looking at Eli's face, seeing the desperate hope flickering there like a candle flame in the wind, she understood why Weston had made it anyway. Sometimes hope was all you had to offer, even when you knew it might not be enough. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed," Mary Ann said briskly, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. "Then you need to sleep. Real sleep, without worrying about what might happen while your eyes are closed." Over the next hour, she and Weston worked together with surprising ease, as if they'd been doing this for years rather than having just met. Weston brought up the promised soup, thick with vegetables and beef, clearly made from scratch, while Mary Ann carefully washed the dirt and sweat from Eli's skin. The boy was so exhausted he could barely keep his eyes open, but he managed to eat half a bowl of soup before sleep finally claimed him. "He'll do," Weston said quietly as they stood in the doorway watching the boy's chest rise and fall. "Kids are tougher than they look, and he's got his father's strength in him." "He shouldn't have to be tough," Mary Ann said, and she couldn't keep the anger from her voice. "He's 7 years old. He should be playing and learning and being a child, not fighting to survive each day." "No argument from me on that." Weston gestured toward the stairs. "Come on, you look like you're about to fall over, and we need to talk about what happens next." Downstairs, Weston poured coffee that was strong enough to strip paint and set out bread and cheese on the scarred wooden table. Mary Ann realized she hadn't eaten since early morning, and suddenly she was ravenous. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional creak of the house settling. "Tell me about the letters," Weston finally said. Garrick seemed pretty interested in them. Mary Ann pulled the bundle from her reticule. 6 months' worth of correspondence tied with a ribbon that now seemed absurdly romantic, given the circumstances. "Thomas wrote to me regularly after I answered his advertisement. He talked about the ranch, about his son, about the life we might build together. And he made promises, in writing, about providing for me if anything happened to him before I arrived." "Let me see them." Mary Ann handed over the letters, watching as Weston read through them with careful attention. His expression remained neutral, but she saw his eyebrows rise once or twice, saw his fingers tighten on the paper. "This is good," he said finally. "Better than good, actually." Thomas was specific about his intentions. He stated multiple times that he wanted you to have joint ownership of the ranch, that he was making arrangements with a lawyer in Tucson to ensure you'd be protected. "Did you know he had a will drawn up?" "He mentioned it," Mary Ann said. "He said he wanted everything legal and proper, that he didn't want me or Eli to be vulnerable if something went wrong." "Smart man. The question is whether he actually got that will filed before he died, and whether Garrick knows about it." Weston tapped the letters thoughtfully. "These alone might not be enough to give you custody of Eli. He's blood family, after all, and the law tends to favor that. But if there's a will naming you as executor or guardian, that changes everything." "How do we find out?" "I'll ride to Tucson tomorrow, check with the courthouse and the lawyers there. It's a day's ride there and back, but it's worth it." He paused. "The problem is Garrick. If he thinks you're a threat to his claim on the ranch, he's not going to sit back and wait for the law to work itself out. He's going to take action, and he's not particular about what kind." Mary Ann felt cold despite the warmth of the coffee. "What kind of action?" "The kind that makes problems disappear," Weston said bluntly. "I don't mean to scare you, but you need to understand what you're up against. Garrick Sloan has a reputation around here. He's been run out of 2 other counties for things that ranged from cattle rustling to assault. He showed up here about 6 months ago, claiming to be Thomas's brother-in-law through a sister who died years ago. Thomas didn't want him around, told me once that Garrick was bad news, but family is family, I guess. And now he has control of everything. For now. But if we can prove Thomas had other plans, if we can show that Garrick's been abusing the boy..." Weston stopped, his expression hardening. We need more than just your word and mine, though. We need witnesses, documentation, something concrete that will stand up in front of a judge. The storekeeper saw Eli's condition today, Marianne said. He gave me the wagon, helped me get water for the boy. Surely that counts for something. Morrison's a good man, and he'll probably testify if we ask. But Garrick will claim the boy ran off, that he couldn't help it if Eli got himself into trouble while he was supposed to be doing chores. Weston rubbed his face tiredly. The problem is that most people around here don't want to get involved. They've got their own problems, their own lives. Standing up against someone like Garrick means making an enemy, and enemies can be dangerous in a place like Red Mesa. Marianne set down her coffee cup with more force than she intended. So what are you saying? That we should just give up? Let Garrick keep abusing that child because it's too inconvenient for people to do the right thing? I'm saying it's going to be harder than you think, Weston said quietly. I'm saying you need to be prepared for the possibility that the law won't help, that people will look the other way, that you might have to make some hard choices about what you're willing to risk. I've already made my choice, Marianne said. I'm not leaving that boy with a monster. Something shifted in Weston's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred stubbornness. All right then. Here's what we do. I ride to Tucson tomorrow, see what I can find out about Thomas's will and any other legal arrangements he might have made. You stay here with Eli, keep him safe, and get him healthy. Don't go back to the Garrett Ranch, don't go into town alone, and don't open the door to anyone except me or Doc Morrison when he gets back from the mining camp. You think Garrick will come here? I think Garrick will do whatever serves his interests. Right now, he's probably drunk and angry, but he's also smart enough to know he needs to tread carefully. Attacking a woman and child on another man's property in broad daylight is different from whatever he was doing to Eli when no one was watching. But if he gets desperate enough, if he thinks he's losing control of the situation, Weston shrugged. I've got a rifle and a shotgun. I'll show you where they are and how to use them if you don't already know. My father taught me to shoot, Marianne said, back in Pennsylvania. It's been years, but I remember the basics. Good. I'll feel better knowing you're not completely defenseless. He stood, gathering the dishes. You should get some rest. You've had a hell of a day, and tomorrow's likely to be just as complicated. Marianne wanted to argue, wanted to keep planning and talking until they had a solution to every possible problem. But exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight, and she knew Weston was right. She needed sleep if she was going to be any use to Eli tomorrow. Upstairs, she checked on the boy one more time, relieved to find him sleeping peacefully, his breathing easier than before. Then she crossed to her own room and finally allowed herself to take in the full reality of her situation. She had left Philadelphia this morning expecting to become a wife. Instead, she had become, what, a guardian to a child who wasn't hers? A squatter on a dead man's ranch? A woman with no legal rights and no money, dependent on the kindness of a stranger to keep her and Eli alive? She should have been terrified. Should have been planning her escape, figuring out how to get back to Philadelphia, how to return to the safety of the life she'd known, even if that life had been suffocating and small. But as she changed into the nightgown Weston had left for her, another item from his mother's carefully preserved possessions, Marianne realized she felt something entirely different. She felt awake. For the first time in her 28 years, she felt fully, completely awake. Every nerve in her body was alive, every sense heightened. The stakes were higher than anything she'd ever faced, the danger more real than any she'd imagined. But she wasn't running. She wasn't collapsing. She was standing her ground, making decisions, taking action, and it felt right in a way nothing else in her life ever had. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless, and Marianne woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then memory rushed back, and she was out of bed and across the hall to check on Eli before she was fully conscious of moving. The boy was sitting up in bed, looking small and lost in Weston's old nightshirt, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been the night before. The fever had broken, leaving his skin cool and slightly damp. "Good morning," Marianne said, relief flooding through her. "How do you feel?" "Hungry," Eli said, and then looked startled, as if he hadn't meant to admit it. "Then let's get you fed. Can you stand?" Together they made their way downstairs, Eli's legs wobbly but functional. In the kitchen, they found Weston already up and cooking, eggs and bacon and potatoes that smelled like heaven. He looked up when they entered, and Marianne saw satisfaction cross his face at the sight of Eli on his feet. "There's the man of the hour," Weston said. "You gave us quite a scare yesterday, young Mr. Garrett." Eli slid into a chair at the table, his eyes wide at the amount of food Weston was dishing onto plates. "Is all that for me?" "All that and more," Weston said. "You're too skinny by half, and we're going to fix that. Eat up." Watching Eli try to eat slowly, try to have manners even though his body was screaming for him to shovel food into his mouth as fast as possible, broke Marianne's heart all over again. This was a child who had learned to be careful, to not draw attention, to take what was offered, and be grateful because it might be snatched away at any moment. "Eli," she said gently, "you can eat as much as you want here. No one's going to take it away or punish you for being hungry. You understand?" The boy looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and slowly nodded. Then, as if testing the truth of her words, he took a larger bite of bacon. When nothing bad happened, when both adults just smiled at him, something in his expression lightened infinitesimally. They ate together in comfortable silence, and Marianne found herself studying Weston in the morning light. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably only 30 or so, but he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. There was a quietness about him, a sense of controlled strength that was entirely different from Garrick's violent aggression. She found herself trusting him in a way she couldn't quite explain, as if some part of her recognized something solid and reliable in him that she'd been searching for without knowing it. "I'll be leaving for Tucson within the hour," Weston said once they'd finished eating. "Should be back before dark if all goes well. Like I said yesterday, you stay here, keep the doors locked, and don't hesitate to use the rifle if you need to." "We'll be fine," Marianne said with more confidence than she felt. "There's food in the pantry, a garden out back if you want fresh vegetables, chickens in the coop. Make yourselves at home." He looked at Eli. "You think you're up for some light chores this afternoon, son? Nothing heavy, but I've got a few things that could use a boy's attention." Eli's face lit up. "Yes, sir, I can work. I'm a good worker, Mr. Drury. I promise I'm sure you are," Weston interrupted gently. "But that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because sometimes keeping busy helps when things are complicated. And because I think you might like meeting my horses. There's a new colt in the barn that's about the friendliest thing you've ever seen." "A colt?" For the first time, Eli sounded like the child he was, excited, curious, eager. "Can I really meet him?" "After you rest a bit more," Marianne said, "and after we get some more food into you, but yes, this afternoon you can meet the colt." After Weston left, the house settled into a peaceful quiet that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the previous day. Marianne spent the morning tidying up, exploring the house, and making sure Eli ate regular small meals to rebuild his strength without overwhelming his shrunken stomach. The boy followed her from room to room like a small shadow, as if afraid she might disappear if he let her out of his sight. "You can relax," Marianne told him as she folded laundry in the kitchen. "I'm not going anywhere." "That's what Pa said," Eli replied quietly. "He said he'd always be here to take care of me. But then the horse kicked him, and he wasn't here anymore." Marianne set down the shirt she'd been folding and knelt beside the boy. "I can't promise I'll never leave, Eli. I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise that I'll fight with everything I have to keep you safe. And I can promise that I chose to be here. Not because of your father, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because when I saw you at that station yesterday, I knew I was supposed to help you. Do you believe me?" Eli studied her face for a long moment, and Marianne forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, to let him see the truth of her words. Finally, slowly, he nodded. "I believe you," he said. "You have kind eyes. Pa always said you could tell a lot about a person by their eyes. Your father was a smart man." "He was the best man," Eli said fiercely. "Uncle Garrick says Pa was weak, says that's why the ranch was failing, why we didn't have any money. But it's not true. Pa worked hard every day. He just didn't have anyone to help him after Mama died. And then he thought you were coming, and he was so happy. He kept saying how everything would be better once you got here." Marianne felt tears prickling her eyes and blinked them back. "I wish I could have met him." "Me too. He would have liked you, and you would have liked him." Eli paused. Are you going to marry Mr. Drury instead? The question caught Marianne completely off guard. What? No, I barely know Mr. Drury. But you like him, Eli said with the unnerving perception of children. I can tell. And he likes you too. He looks at you the way Pa used to look at the picture of Mama he kept by his bed. Eli, that's not... Marianne stopped, realizing she had no idea how to explain the complicated tangle of gratitude, attraction, and uncertainty she felt toward Weston Drury. Mr. Drury is helping us because he's a good man and he cared about your father. That's all. If you say so, Eli said, but his expression suggested he didn't believe her for a second. They spent the afternoon in the barn as promised, and Marianne found herself enchanted by the colt Weston had mentioned, a leggy sorrel with a white star on his forehead and a gentle disposition. Eli was transformed in the presence of the horses, his anxiety melting away as he carefully brushed the colt's coat and murmured to him in a voice too soft for Marianne to hear. Pa was teaching me about horses, Eli said as they walked back to the house. He said someday I'd have my own to train and care for. But Uncle Garrick sold most of them after Pa died. Said we didn't need so many mouths to feed. Well, maybe someday you'll have a whole herd of your own, Marianne said, when you're grown and have your own ranch to run. Do you think I will? Have my own ranch? I think you can have whatever you're willing to work for, Eli. Your father left you land and a legacy. We just have to make sure you get to keep it. The sun was low on the horizon when they heard the sound of a horse approaching. Marianne's heart jumped into her throat, and she instinctively pulled Eli behind her as she moved to the window. But it was Weston returning, his horse moving at a steady trot, saddlebags bulging with whatever he'd acquired in Tucson. He looked tired, but satisfied as he dismounted, and Marianne felt relief wash over her. She hadn't realized how anxious she'd been until that moment, hadn't let herself acknowledge how vulnerable they were without him there. Well? She asked as soon as he came through the door. Good news and complicated news, Weston said, pulling papers from his saddlebag. Thomas did file a will. It's all legal and proper, witnessed and notarized, and in it, he names you as Eli's guardian and gives you ownership of the ranch in the event of his death before your marriage. Marianne felt her knees go weak. He really did that? He really did. Apparently, he had a lawyer friend in Tucson who helped him arrange everything. The lawyer, man named Patterson, remembered Thomas well, said he was absolutely determined to protect both you and Eli no matter what happened. Weston spread the papers on the table. The complication is that Garrick has already been to the courthouse, claiming to be Eli's only living relative and therefore entitled to guardianship and control of the estate. But the will supersedes his claim, but only if we can get it properly executed, which means we need to bring it before a judge, prove its validity, and argue that Garrick's guardianship should be terminated based on neglect and abuse. Weston looked at Eli, who was listening with wide eyes. Son, do you think you could tell a judge what happened while you were living with your uncle? The truth about how he treated you? Eli went pale, and his hand found Marianne's. Would he be there? Uncle Garrick? Would he be in the room? Probably, Weston admitted. But there would be other people there too. The judge, maybe a sheriff, me and Miss Marianne. You wouldn't be alone with him. What if the judge doesn't believe me? Eli's voice was small and scared. What if they send me back? Marianne knelt down and took both his hands. That's not going to happen. We have proof now, your father's will, the letters, Mr. Drury's testimony, the storekeeper's account of your condition. We have everything we need to keep you safe. But even as she said it, she saw the doubt in Weston's eyes and knew it wasn't that simple. Legal documents were one thing. Making them stand up against a man who was willing to lie, cheat, and intimidate to get his way was something else entirely. When can we go before the judge? Marianne asked. Circuit judge comes through Red Mesa next week. We'll file the papers then, make our case, and hopefully settle this once and for all. Weston paused. But that gives Garrick a week to make trouble. A week to try to intimidate witnesses or muddy the waters or... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. A week was a long time when you were dealing with a desperate man who had everything to lose. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Marianne and Weston sat on the porch and watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. The temperature had finally dropped to something bearable, and a slight breeze carried the scent of sage and dust. "Thank you," Marianne said quietly, "for everything you've done. I know you didn't have to help us, and I know it's putting you at risk, but I want you to know I'm grateful." "I'm not doing anything special," Weston said, "just what any decent person would do." "That's not true, and you know it. Most people wouldn't have gotten involved. Most people would have kept writing and told themselves it wasn't their problem." She turned to look at him in the dim light. "Why did you really stop yesterday? And don't tell me it was just because you knew Thomas." Weston was quiet for so long that Marianne thought he might not answer. Then, "My sister had a boy. Sweet kid, full of life. When she died, her husband remarried fast. Too fast. The new wife didn't want another woman's child around. Made that boy's life hell for 2 years before my brother-in-law finally saw what was happening and sent him to live with us." He paused. He was 8 years old and so scared of his own shadow, he'd flinch if you moved too fast near him. Took my mother 6 months to get him to believe he was safe, that no one was going to hurt him anymore. "Where is he now?" "Working on a ranch in Montana, last I heard. Grown man with a family of his own. But I remember what he was like when he first came to us, and when I saw Eli yesterday." Weston's jaw tightened. I saw that same look in his eyes, that same fear, and I knew I couldn't walk away. Marianne reached out and took his hand, a gesture that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "You're a good man, Weston Drury." "I'm just a man trying to do right by a boy who deserves better than the hand he's been dealt." He looked down at their joined hands but didn't pull away. "But I'm glad you're here, Marianne. Eli needs you, and maybe—" He stopped, then started again. "Maybe I do too." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and honest, and Marianne felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sound split the night. The thunder of hooves approaching fast, too fast for a casual visitor. Weston was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Lock the door and get Eli. If anything happens, if you hear shots, you take him and go out the back. Head north toward the Morrison place. Don't stop. Don't look back." "Weston, now, Marianne!" She ran. Behind her, she heard Weston step off the porch, heard him call out a challenge into the darkness. Marianne burst through the door and took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Eli was sitting up in bed, his face white in the moonlight streaming through the window. "What's happening?" he whispered. "I don't know yet, but we need to be ready to move if Mr. Drury tells us to." Marianne grabbed the boy's shoes and helped him put them on with shaking hands. "Can you be brave for me, Eli? Can you be very quiet and very fast if I need you to?" Eli nodded, his jaw set with determination that looked far too old for his young face. Together they crept to the top of the stairs, Marianne positioning herself where she could see the front door while keeping Eli behind her. Through the window she could make out shapes in the yard, Weston standing his ground, and another figure on horseback, backlit by the rising moon. "I said state your business or turn around," Weston's voice carried clearly through the open window, hard and controlled. "My business is my nephew." Garrick Sloane's voice was thick with drink but steady enough to be dangerous. "You've got something that belongs to me, Drury. I want him back." "The boy doesn't belong to you or anyone else. He's not property. He's family, blood, and blood trumps whatever legal nonsense you think you've got cooked up." There was a pause, and Marianne heard the creak of leather as Garrick shifted in his saddle. "I know you went to Tucson. I know you were sniffing around the courthouse, asking questions about Thomas's will. You think I'm stupid, Drury? You think I didn't plan for this? I think you're desperate. I think you know that will is legitimate, and that you're about to lose everything you thought you'd stolen from a dead man and his son." Garrick laughed, and the sound made Marianne's skin crawl. "Stolen? I'm his uncle. I'm the one who took him in when he had nobody else. I'm the one who fed him and clothed him and put a roof over his head. And this is the thanks I get? Some Philadelphia whore shows up and decides she wants to play house with my nephew and my land?" Marianne heard Eli gasp beside her, heard the sharp intake of breath that preceded tears, but she couldn't move, couldn't comfort him. She was frozen at the top of the stairs, watching through the window as Weston took a step forward, his whole body radiating controlled fury. "You want to say that again?" Weston's voice was deadly quiet now. "Because I don't think I heard you right." "You heard me just fine. That woman's got no claim here except what's written in some letters by a man who was too soft in the head to know he was being played. Thomas always was a fool for a sad story. But I'm not. I know exactly what she is. An opportunist who saw a chance to grab a ranch and a ready-made family without having to work for either." "You're wrong." The words were out of Marianne's mouth before she realized she was moving, before she understood that she was walking down the stairs and toward the front door. Behind her, Eli called her name, but she kept going, driven by a rage so pure it burned away fear. "Marianne, don't—" Weston started, but she was already pushing past him, stepping off the porch to face Garrick Sloane in the moonlight. "You don't know anything about me," she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. "You don't know what I left behind, what I sacrificed, what I hoped for when I came here. But I'll tell you what I know about you. I know you're a coward and a bully. I know you've been hurting a defenseless child for weeks, working him half to death and beating him when he couldn't do enough to satisfy you. I know you've been drinking away whatever money the ranch had while that boy went hungry. And I know that you're terrified right now because your meal ticket is about to disappear." Garrick's horse danced sideways, responding to the sudden tension in its rider. In the moonlight, Marianne could see Garrick's face clearly now, the flush of alcohol and anger, the way his jaw worked as he ground his teeth. He looked like a man barely holding on to control, like a rattlesnake coiled to strike. "Careful, lady. You're making accusations you can't prove." "Can I?" "Your nephew has bruises in the shape of your fingers on his arms. The storekeeper in town saw him collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Mr. Drury can testify to the condition of the ranch, the neglect, the decay, the evidence of your incompetence. And I have Thomas Garrett's letters stating explicitly that he wanted me to have guardianship of his son and ownership of his land. So please, Mr. Sloane, tell me again how I can't prove anything." For a moment, there was absolute silence. Even the night sounds seemed to have stopped, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath. Then Garrick's hand moved toward his belt, and Marianne heard the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. "That's far enough." Weston's rifle was suddenly level, aimed directly at Garrick's chest. "You pull that weapon and you won't live long enough to regret it." Garrick froze, his hand hovering near his gun. Marianne could see him calculating, weighing his options. He was drunk and angry, but he wasn't suicidal. Weston Drury had a reputation in Red Mesa, and not the kind that invited reckless challenges. "This isn't over," Garrick finally said, his hand moving away from his gun, but his eyes promising violence. "That boy is mine by law until a judge says otherwise. And when we get in front of that judge, I'll tell him about you two, playing at house, carrying on like you're married when you're not, exposing an impressionable child to immoral behavior. How do you think that'll look to a circuit judge who believes in family values and Christian decency?" "Get off my property," Weston said. "And if you come back here without a legal summons, I'll shoot you on sight for trespassing. I'll see you in court, Drury. And when I win, and I will win, I'll make sure you both regret the day you decided to interfere in family business." Garrick yanked his horse's head around and spurred it into a gallop, disappearing into the darkness with a drumming of hooves that gradually faded into silence. Marianne stood there, trembling now that the confrontation was over, feeling the weight of what had just happened settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She had just made an enemy of a dangerous man, had escalated a situation that might have been resolved quietly. And for what? For pride? For anger? For a boy she'd known for less than 2 days? "That was either very brave or very foolish," Weston said quietly, lowering his rifle. "I haven't decided which yet." "It was necessary," Marianne said, but her voice shook on the words. "He needed to know we're not going to back down, that we're not afraid of him. But we should be afraid of him, or at least cautious." Weston turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his expression was impossible to read. "He's right about one thing. We've given him ammunition to use against us in court. A woman and a man living under the same roof without being married, with a child in the house. That's not going to look good to a judge, especially not one who's already inclined to favor blood relatives. Marianne felt cold dread seeping into her bones. She hadn't thought about that, hadn't considered how their living arrangement might appear to others. In Philadelphia, it would have been scandalous beyond repair. Out here, where propriety was often a luxury people couldn't afford, she'd thought the rules might be different. But clearly, she'd been wrong. "What do we do?" she asked. "I don't know yet, but we need to think carefully about our next moves. Garrick's going to be looking for any advantage, any weakness he can exploit, and we just showed him exactly where to strike." Weston sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Come on, let's get inside and figure this out." Eli was huddled at the top of the stairs, his face streaked with tears he'd tried to hide. Marianne went to him immediately, pulling him into her arms and feeling how hard he was shaking. "It's all right," she murmured. "Everything's all right. He's gone." "He'll come back," Eli whispered against her shoulder. "He always comes back, and he'll be so angry. You don't know what he's like when he's really angry. Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But right now, you're safe. You're here with me and Mr. Drury, and nothing bad is going to happen to you tonight." She carried the boy back to bed. He was light enough that it was easy, too light, and sat with him until his breathing evened out and sleep claimed him. But even in sleep, he twitched and jerked, fighting battles in his dreams that Marianne couldn't protect him from. Downstairs, she found Weston sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured without asking and slid one across to her. "I don't usually drink," Marianne said. "Neither do I, but tonight seems like a good night to make an exception." He raised his glass. "To complicated situations and the people foolish enough to stand in the middle of them." Marianne touched her glass to his and drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a clean burn, a warmth that spread through her chest and loosened the knot of fear that had been growing there since Garrick rode away. "He's going to cause trouble at the hearing," Weston said after a moment. "Everything he said about us. He's going to use it. He's going to paint you as a woman of questionable morals and me as a man taking advantage of an innocent child for my own purposes." "Can he really do that, with Thomas's will and the letters and everything else we have?" "He can try, and depending on the judge, it might work." Weston drained his glass and poured another. "Circuit judges out here see a lot of gray areas. They have to make judgment calls based on incomplete information and their own prejudices. If Garrick can make us look like we're running some kind of improper household, if he can make himself look like a concerned uncle trying to protect his nephew from corrupting influences, then we need to take away his ammunition," Marianne interrupted. "We need to make it impossible for him to question our morality or our intentions." "And how do you propose we do that?" Marianne took another sip of whiskey, feeling it burn away the last of her hesitation. "We get married." The silence that followed was so complete that Marianne could hear the clock ticking in the parlor, could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Weston stared at her as if she'd suddenly started speaking another language. "What?" "We get married," Marianne repeated, more firmly this time. "Before the hearing. That way, Garrick can't accuse us of impropriety. That way, we present a united front, a proper family unit that wants to give Eli a stable, loving home. The judge would have no grounds to question our living arrangement, and Garrick's accusations would look like exactly what they are, the desperate attacks of a man trying to hold on to something that was never his to begin with. Marianne, you can't be serious. We barely know each other." "I know enough." She leaned forward, willing him to understand. "I know you're a good man. I know you care about Eli and you're willing to risk your own safety to protect him. I know you've given us shelter and help when you had no obligation to do so. And I know that I came here prepared to marry a stranger for the sake of a better life. At least with you, I'd be marrying someone I actually trust. But marriage, that's not something you just undo if it doesn't work out. You'd be tied to me, legally and in every other way. If this goes wrong, if we can't make it work, then we'll deal with that if and when it happens. But right now, Weston, this is about protecting Eli. This is about taking away Garrick's weapons and giving ourselves the strongest possible position when we walk into that courthouse." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not expecting romance or devotion or anything beyond mutual respect and a shared commitment to keeping that boy safe. Can you give me that much?" Weston looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. Marianne held her breath, waiting for him to pull away, to tell her she was insane, to refuse this desperate gambit. Instead, slowly, his fingers tightened around hers. "This is crazy," he said. "I know. We're probably going to regret it. Maybe. And you understand that once we do this, there's no going back? No matter what happens with Eli and the ranch, we'll be married. Legally, permanently, until death or divorce." "I understand." Weston was quiet for another long moment. Then, so softly she almost didn't hear him, "All right. If you're sure this is what you want, if you truly believe it's the best way to protect Eli, then yes, I'll marry you." Marianne felt something unfurl in her chest. Relief, certainly, but also something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We still have to convince a judge that a marriage of convenience is actually a real family. We still have to prove that we're better for Eli than his blood relative. And we still have to survive Garrick Sloane's attempts to destroy us before we even get to court." "One problem at a time," Marianne said. "First thing tomorrow, we find whoever can marry us legally. Then we start building our case. And then we face Garrick Sloane and whatever he throws at us." They sat there in the quiet kitchen, hands still joined across the scarred table, two strangers about to bind their lives together for the sake of a boy neither of them had known a week ago. It should have felt wrong, Marianne thought. It should have felt desperate and foolish and doomed. Instead, it felt like the first truly honest decision she'd made in her entire life. The next morning dawned bright and merciless, the sun already promising another scorching day. Marianne woke early, her mind racing with everything that needed to be done. She found Weston already up, feeding the horses, moving with the easy efficiency of a man who'd been doing these chores since before he could remember. "I've been thinking," he said when she joined him in the barn. "There's a preacher about 10 miles south. He travels a circuit, but I think he's at the widow Harrison's place right now. We could ride there today, get married quiet and quick, have him file the paperwork with the county before Garrick even knows what happened." "What about Eli? Should we tell him?" "We have to. He's going to find out anyway, and he deserves to know what we're planning." Weston set down the feed bucket and turned to face her. "But Marianne, before we do this, before we make it real, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I pity you or because I want to take advantage of the situation. I'm doing it because I believe it's the right thing for Eli, and because I think you and I might actually make decent partners in this mess we found ourselves in." "I know," Marianne said, "and I need you to understand that I'm not looking for a rescuer or a replacement for the life I left behind. I'm looking for an ally, someone who'll stand with me when things get hard. Can you be that?" "I can try," Weston said, and there was something in his gray eyes that made Marianne believe him. "I can definitely try." They told Eli over breakfast, carefully explaining why they thought getting married was necessary, why it would help protect him from Garrick. The boy listened with that too serious expression that had become familiar, processing everything with a solemnity that broke Marianne's heart. "Will you be my ma for real then?" he finally asked, looking at Marianne with those dark, hopeful eyes. "If you want me to be," Marianne said carefully. "I know I can never replace your real mother, Eli, but I can promise to do my best to take care of you and love you like she would have wanted." "And Mr. Drury would be like my new pa?" Weston shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not trying to replace your father, son, but I'd be honored to help look after you and teach you things and, well, be there for you, if that's something you'd want." Eli looked between them, and slowly, a small smile appeared on his face, the first real smile Marianne had seen from him. "I think Pa would like you, Mr. Drury, and I think he'd be happy that Miss Marianne found you instead of being all alone. So yes, I want you to get married. I want us to be a real family." The simplicity of his acceptance, the easy way he embraced this strange new arrangement, made Marianne's eyes sting with tears. Children were resilient, everyone said. But Eli wasn't just resilient, he was brave and generous and willing to trust when he had every reason not to. He deserved so much better than the hand fate had dealt him. They rode out an hour later, Eli sitting in front of Weston on his horse, while Marianne rode the gentler mare from the barn. The day was already heating up, the sun beating down without mercy, but there was something almost celebratory about the journey. Eli chatted happily about the horses and the landscape, pointing out hawks circling overhead and asking 1,000 questions about everything they passed. The widow Harrison's place was a small but well-kept homestead tucked into a valley where a spring provided year-round water. The widow herself was a weathered woman in her 60s who took one look at their party and seemed to understand exactly what they needed. "Preacher Daniels is out back fixing my chicken coop," she said. "But I'll warn you, he'll want to counsel you before he marries you. Takes the sacrament seriously, that one." Preacher Daniels turned out to be a thin man with kind eyes and a voice that carried the hint of education back east. He listened to their story without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as they explained about Thomas's death, Garrick's abuse, and their plan to present a united front for Eli's sake. "Marriage isn't meant to be a legal strategy," he said when they'd finished. "It's a sacred covenant before God." "I understand that, preacher," Weston said, "and I'm not taking this lightly. But this boy needs protection, and we believe this is the best way to provide it." "And what happens after? When the legal battle is won or lost? Will you stay married then, or will this covenant be abandoned as soon as it's no longer convenient?" Marianne spoke up before Weston could answer. "I don't know what the future holds, Preacher Daniels. I can't promise that Weston and I will fall in love or that this will turn into a traditional marriage, but I can promise that we're entering this commitment with honesty and respect for each other. And I can promise that we'll honor our vows to the best of our ability, whatever that means for us." The preacher studied them both for a long moment. Then he looked at Eli, who was watching the adults with anxious eyes. "Young man, do you want these two to get married?" "Yes, sir," Eli said immediately. "I want Miss Marianne to be my ma, and Mr. Drury to help take care of us. I want us to be a family." "And you understand that families stick together through hard times? That marriage means working things out instead of running away when it gets difficult?" "Yes, sir. Pa always said family was the most important thing. He said you take care of family no matter what." Preacher Daniels sighed, but there was warmth in his expression now. "All right, I'll marry you. But I'll be praying that this marriage of necessity becomes something more, something real and lasting. And I'll be checking in on you, making sure you're honoring the commitment you're about to make." The ceremony was simple, conducted in the widow Harrison's parlor with her and Eli as witnesses. Marianne had no ring to give, no special dress to wear. Weston had no prepared vows beyond the traditional words the preacher spoke. But as they stood there in the afternoon light, promising to honor and cherish each other for better or worse, Marianne felt the weight of what they were doing settle onto her shoulders. This was real. This was binding. Whatever happened next, she was now Marianne Drury, wife of a man she'd known for 3 days, stepmother to a boy who'd been a stranger less than a week ago. When Preacher Daniels pronounced them married and told Weston he could kiss his bride, there was an awkward pause. Then Weston leaned forward and pressed a brief, gentle kiss to Marianne's lips. Nothing romantic or passionate, just a seal on the agreement they'd made. But Marianne felt it in every nerve, felt the promise of it, the reality of being connected to this man in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Congratulations," the preacher said, signing their marriage certificate with a flourish. "May God bless your union and give you the strength to face whatever challenges come your way." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, now legally husband and wife, with a marriage certificate tucked safely in Weston's saddlebag, and Eli chattering excitedly about what it meant to have a real family again. Marianne felt numb, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd just done. She'd left Philadelphia planning to marry Thomas Garrett, a stranger who'd wooed her with letters. Instead, she'd married Weston Drury, a stranger who'd wooed her not at all, but who'd shown her more kindness in 3 days than anyone had in years. "No regrets?" Weston asked quietly as they approached the ranch. "Ask me again in a week," Marianne said. "After the hearing, after we see if this actually works." "Fair enough." He glanced at her and something like a smile touched his lips. "But for what it's worth, I think we might surprise ourselves. I think we might actually be good at this." Marianne wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that this hasty, desperate marriage might somehow transform into something real. But as they rode into the yard and she saw the broken fence post lying in the dirt, fresh damage that hadn't been there that morning, her optimism evaporated. "Weston," she said, pointing. He saw it immediately, his expression darkening. Dismounting quickly, he examined the post, then walked the fence line while Marianne stayed on horseback with Eli. "3 posts cut through," he called back. "Clean cuts with a saw. And—" He crouched down, studying something in the dirt. "Fresh horse tracks. Looks like multiple riders." "Garrick," Marianne said. "Warning shot," Weston agreed grimly. "Letting us know he can get to us any time he wants, that our property, our safety, is only as secure as he allows it to be." Eli had gone quiet, all his earlier happiness draining away. Marianne pulled him closer, feeling the tension in his small body. "We knew he wouldn't go quietly," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We knew he'd escalate." "Knowing it and experiencing it are 2 different things." Weston walked back to his horse, his jaw set. "We need to be more careful. Need to keep watch at night, make sure the barn and animals are secure. And we need to file a report with the sheriff, get this documented before the hearing." Will the sheriff even do anything? Probably not, but it establishes a pattern, shows that Garrick's been harassing us, trying to intimidate us. Every little bit of evidence helps. He swung back into the saddle and looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "You sure you want to go through with this? Because it's only going to get worse before it gets better. Garrick's feeling cornered now, and cornered animals are the most dangerous kind." Marianne thought about running, about taking Eli and disappearing, finding some town where Garrick couldn't follow, where they could start over without the constant threat hanging over them. But she knew it was impossible. You couldn't outrun the law, and legally, Garrick still had a claim on Eli. The only way forward was through the confrontation, through the hearing, through whatever Garrick threw at them between now and then. "I'm sure," she said, "we're in this now, all of us together, and we're going to see it through to the end." As they put the horses away and secured the barn for the night, as they ate a quiet dinner and got Eli settled in bed, Marianne kept thinking about the cut fence posts and what they represented. Garrick wasn't just trying to scare them. He was testing their defenses, looking for weaknesses, planning his next move. And the next confrontation, when it came, would be worse than the last. But they had something now that they hadn't had before. They had the legal protection of marriage, the strength of Thomas's will, and the beginnings of a case that might actually stand up in court. And they had each other, 3 people who'd been strangers less than a week ago, now bound together by circumstance and choice into something that looked, from the outside at least, like a family. Whether that would be enough to survive what was coming, Marianne didn't know. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, hearing Weston moving around downstairs on watch, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt like she belonged somewhere, like she was fighting for something that mattered, like she was finally truly alive. And whatever happened next, whatever price they had to pay, she knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't trade this moment for anything. Not for safety, not for ease, not for the comfortable, suffocating life she'd left behind in Philadelphia. She was Marianne Drury now, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The week before the hearing passed with agonizing slowness, each day stretching out under the relentless summer sun like a test of endurance. Weston spent his mornings repairing the damage Garrick's men had done to the fence, his afternoons teaching Eli how to properly care for the horses, and his nights sitting on the porch with the rifle across his lap, watching the darkness for movement. Marianne threw herself into domesticity with fierce determination, transforming Weston's bachelor household into something that looked like an actual home. Curtains washed and mended, meals cooked with care, floors swept until they gleamed. She needed the judge to see a proper family when he looked at them, needed every detail to support their claim that Eli belonged with them and not with Garrick. On the 3rd day, Sheriff Coleman finally rode out to take their statement about the vandalism. He was a gray-haired man with tired eyes who listened to their account with the air of someone who'd heard too many complaints and could act on too few. "I'll make a note of it," he said, scribbling in his book. "But unless you actually saw Garrick Sloan or his men cutting those posts, there's not much I can do. Could have been anybody passing through." "We both know it was Garrick," Weston said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Who else would have reason to? What I know and what I can prove in front of a judge are two different things, Drury. You know that. Coleman closed his book and looked at them both with something that might have been sympathy. Look, I heard you two got married. That's good. Gives you better standing when Judge Morrison comes through. But you need to understand that Garrick's got friends in this county. People who owe him money or favors. And some of those people have been saying things about how convenient this marriage is. How it happened awful fast after Mrs. Drury arrived in town. What kind of things? Marianne asked, though she already knew. The knot in her stomach had been growing tighter every day as she anticipated exactly this. That maybe you and Drury had an understanding before you ever got on that train from Philadelphia. That maybe Thomas Garrett's death wasn't the accident everyone thought it was. That maybe you're both trying to steal a dead man's ranch by using his boy as an excuse. Coleman held up his hand when Weston started to protest. I'm not saying I believe any of it. I'm just telling you what people are whispering. And Judge Morrison hears everything, whether he admits it or not. After the sheriff left, Marianne and Weston sat at the kitchen table in heavy silence. Eli was outside playing with the colt, his laughter drifting through the open window like a reminder of what they were fighting for. They're going to make us look like criminals, Marianne said finally. Garrick's poisoning the well before we even get to court. Then we need to be perfect, Weston replied. No mistakes, no ammunition for him to use. We present ourselves as exactly what we are, a married couple trying to honor a dead man's wishes and protect his son. But are we perfect, Weston? Can we even pretend to be? Marianne looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the exhaustion in his face, the worry he tried to hide. We're two people who barely know each other, playing at being married, living separate lives under the same roof. If Garrick's lawyer questions us, if they dig into our marriage, then we tell the truth. That we married to protect Eli, yes, but that we're building something real. That we respect each other, that we're committed to making this work. He reached across the table and took her hand, and the gesture was becoming familiar now, comfortable. And it's not entirely a lie, is it? We are building something here. Maybe not a conventional marriage, but something that matters. Marianne wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that the moments of easy companionship they'd found over the past few days, working together in the kitchen, talking late into the night about their pasts and their hopes, watching Eli slowly transform from a terrified shadow into something approaching a normal child, added up to something substantial enough to withstand legal scrutiny. But doubt gnawed at her, whispering that they were playing a dangerous game with no guarantee of winning. That afternoon, Doc Morrison finally returned from the mining camp and rode out to examine Eli. He was a gruff man with gentle hands who took his time checking the boy over, noting the healing bruises, the still too prominent ribs, the way Eli flinched when he moved too quickly. He's malnourished and he's been beaten, Morrison said bluntly once Eli was outside again. Not just once or twice. This is systematic abuse over weeks, maybe months. I can testify to that if you need me to. We need you to, Weston said. Will you? Morrison was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at where Eli was brushing the colt with intense concentration. Garrick Sloane's not a man to make an enemy of. Last person who testified against him in court had his barn burned down 2 months later. Never could prove it was Garrick, but everyone knew. So that's a no? Marianne couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. That's a yes, but a cautious one. Morrison turned back to face them. I'll testify because it's the right thing to do. Because that boy deserves better than what he's gotten. But you two need to understand, winning in court might not be the end of this. Might just be the beginning of a different kind of fight. After Morrison left, Marianne found Weston in the barn, forking hay with more force than necessary. She could see the tension in every line of his body, the frustration of a man who was used to solving problems through direct action but was now trapped in a system that moved at its own pace. We're gonna win, she said, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. We have Thomas's will, the marriage certificate, Doc Morrison's testimony, the letters. We have everything we need. Do we? Weston drove the pitchfork into the ground and turned to face her. Because I keep thinking about what happens if we don't. If the judge decides that blood is thicker than water, that Garrick's rights as an uncle outweigh a hastily made will and a marriage of convenience, what happens to Eli then? We don't let that happen. How? How do we stop it if the law says Garrick wins? His voice was raw with emotion now, all his careful control slipping. I can't just stand by and watch that boy be handed back to a man who'll destroy him. I can't do it, Marianne. I won't. She understood what he wasn't saying, heard the dangerous promise beneath his words. If the legal system failed them, Weston would take matters into his own hands. He would break the law to save Eli, would risk everything, his freedom, his ranch, his future, to keep the boy safe. And the terrifying thing was, Marianne knew she would help him. They had crossed some invisible line in the past week, had moved from strangers to allies to something more, partners in a cause that mattered more than either of their individual lives. Let's cross that bridge if we come to it, she said quietly. Right now, we focus on the hearing, on presenting the best possible case, on showing Judge Morrison that we're exactly what Eli needs. The night before the hearing, none of them could sleep. Eli kept appearing at the top of the stairs with questions and worries, until finally Weston set up a bedroll in the parlor and told the boy to sleep there where he could see them. Marianne and Weston sat at the kitchen table going over their testimony one more time, making sure their stories aligned, that they could answer any question thrown at them. What if they ask about our wedding night? Marianne asked suddenly, then felt her face flush. I mean, if Garrick's trying to prove our marriage isn't real, that seems like the kind of detail his lawyer might question. Weston's expression was carefully neutral. Then we tell them it's not their business, that our private life is exactly that, private. But if they push, then we remind them that plenty of marriages out here are practical arrangements first and romantic ones later, if ever. That doesn't make them any less valid legally. He paused, studying her face. Unless you think we need to make this marriage look more conventional, we could, if you wanted to. No, Marianne said quickly, understanding what he was offering and feeling panic flutter in her chest. They had separate rooms, had barely touched beyond those moments when Weston took her hand or helped her down from a horse. Changing that now, before the hearing, would feel like one more manipulation, one more lie in a situation already too complicated. No, I think honesty is better. We married to protect Eli, and we're building a partnership. That's enough. But later, lying in her bed unable to sleep, Marianne wondered if it was enough. Wondered if the judge would see through their careful construction to the truth beneath, that they were two desperate people clinging to a legal fiction, hoping it would be strong enough to withstand scrutiny. She thought about Thomas Garrett, the man she'd never met, and wondered if he would approve of what they were doing. If he would understand that sometimes love comes in unexpected forms, that sometimes family is built from necessity and choice rather than blood and time. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it the oppressive heat and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. They dressed carefully, Weston in his best shirt and coat despite the temperature, Marianne in the one good dress she owned, Eli in clothes that Weston had purchased in town, finally fitting him properly. They looked, Marianne thought critically, like a family. They looked like people who belonged together. The ride into Red Mesa took an hour, and with every mile, Marianne felt the weight of what they were about to face pressing down on her. The town was busier than she'd ever seen it, people gathering for the circuit judge's arrival like it was entertainment. She could feel eyes on them as they rode through, could hear the whispers starting even before they dismounted. The courthouse was a squat wooden building that served as a general meeting hall most of the time. Inside, it was already stifling, the air thick and still despite the open windows. Garrick was there with his lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Webb, who had the look of someone who'd bent the law so many times it stayed curved, and several other men Marianne didn't recognize. Garrick himself looked almost respectable in clean clothes and freshly shaved, all evidence of the violent drunk from that night at the ranch carefully hidden. Judge Morrison turned out to be a heavy-set man with white hair and the tired expression of someone who'd seen everything human nature had to offer and wasn't impressed by much of it anymore. He called the hearing to order with a bang of his gavel that made Eli jump, then looked at the assembled parties with obvious distaste. "Let me be clear," he said. "This is not a trial. This is a hearing to determine custody and guardianship of Eli Garrett, minor child. I'll hear testimony from both parties, review any documentation, and make a decision based on what I believe is in the best interest of the child. My decision is final unless appealed to a higher court, which can take months. Are we understood?" Everyone nodded. Webb stood first, smoothing his coat. Your Honor, my client, Garrick Sloan, is the legal uncle of Eli Garrett and his closest living blood relative. By law and custom, guardianship should automatically fall to him following the tragic death of his brother-in-law, Thomas Garrett. We're here today because certain parties have attempted to circumvent that natural order through a series of suspicious legal maneuvers and a hasty marriage that reeks of fraud. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Webb, Judge Morrison said. You have evidence of fraud? I have a timeline that speaks for itself, Your Honor. Miss Marianne Locke, Mrs. Drury now, arrives in Red Mesa on a specific date, supposedly to marry Thomas Garrett. But Garrett has been dead for 3 weeks by that point. Rather than return to Philadelphia as any reasonable person would, Mrs. Drury immediately insinuates herself into the household of one Weston Drury, a neighbor of the deceased. Within days, not weeks or months, but days, she marries this Mr. Drury in a quiet ceremony with minimal witnesses. And now they present themselves as Eli's guardians based on a will that conveniently gives them control of a valuable ranch. If that's not fraud, Your Honor, I don't know what is. Marianne felt cold despite the heat. Webb was good. He was making their actions sound calculated and mercenary, making everything they'd done look suspicious. She glanced at Weston and saw his jaw tighten, saw him struggling to maintain his composure. Mr. Drury? Judge Morrison looked at Weston. You have representation? No, Your Honor, just myself and the truth. Then let's hear it. Tell me your version of events. Weston stood, and Marianne was struck by how solid he looked, how steady. Your Honor, my wife and I met under unusual circumstances, that's true. But there's nothing fraudulent about what we've done. Marianne came here in good faith to marry Thomas Garrett based on letters and promises he made. She had no way of knowing he'd died before she arrived. When she got off that train, she found Eli Garrett alone, sick and desperate, abandoned at the station by his uncle who was supposed to be caring for him. That's a lie, Garrick burst out, but Webb put a hand on his arm and he subsided. We have testimony from the storekeeper who saw Eli's condition, Weston continued. The boy was suffering from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and malnutrition. He had bruises consistent with physical abuse. Doc Morrison examined him and can verify all of this. Marianne did what any decent person would do. She helped him. And when she discovered the circumstances of his life with Garrick Sloan, she decided she couldn't abandon him. So she married you. Judge Morrison's tone was skeptical. That seems like quite a leap, Mr. Drury. We married because we believed it was the best way to protect Eli and honor Thomas Garrett's wishes. And yes, it happened quickly, but frontier marriages often do. My own parents married 3 weeks after meeting. That doesn't make the commitment any less real or valid. Let me see this will everyone keeps mentioning. Weston handed over the documents and Judge Morrison read them carefully, his expression giving nothing away. The courtroom was silent except for the buzzing of flies and the creak of the floorboards as people shifted nervously. This appears to be legitimate, the judge finally said, properly witnessed and notarized. Thomas Garrett clearly intended for Mrs. Drury, to have guardianship of his son and ownership of his property. Mr. Webb, does your client dispute the validity of this will? We dispute the circumstances under which it was executed, Webb said smoothly. Thomas Garrett was a widower, lonely and vulnerable. This woman, he gestured at Marianne, corresponded with him for months, clearly manipulating him into making provisions that benefited her. For all we know, she encouraged him to take risks that led to his death. That's enough, Judge Morrison snapped. Unless you have actual evidence that Mrs. Drury somehow caused Thomas Garrett's death, which I assume you don't since the death certificate clearly states it was an accident, I won't have wild speculation in my courtroom. Webb inclined his head, acknowledging the rebuke, but Marianne could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He'd planted the seed of doubt, and that might be enough. I'd like to hear from the boy, Judge Morrison said. Eli Garrett, come up here, please. Eli looked at Marianne with terrified eyes, and she nodded encouragingly even though her heart was pounding. The boy made his way to the front of the courtroom, so small and vulnerable that several people in the audience murmured sympathetically. Son, I need you to answer some questions honestly, Judge Morrison said, his voice gentler now. No one's going to punish you for telling the truth. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Eli whispered. Good. Now tell me about living with your Uncle Garrick after your father died. How did he treat you? Eli's hands were shaking, and he kept glancing at Garrick, who was staring at him with an expression that looked benevolent, but that Marianne knew was a threat. The boy opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling. Take your time, Judge Morrison said. Eli's voice was barely audible. He said I had to earn my keep, that I was a burden, and Pa had left him with nothing but debts and a useless boy. Did he hurt you? The silence stretched out, terrible and heavy. Marianne could see Eli's internal battle, the years of being told to keep quiet, warring with the desperate need to tell the truth. Finally, in a voice that broke halfway through, Yes, sir, he hurt me a lot. Can you show the court? With trembling hands, Eli pulled up his sleeve, revealing the faded bruises that Doc Morrison had documented. Then he lifted his shirt, showing the marks across his ribs. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and Judge Morrison banged his gavel for order. That's enough, son. You can sit down. The judge's face was grim as he turned to Garrick. Mr. Sloan, you have anything to say about this? Garrick stood, and Marianne had to admire his performance. He looked shocked and concerned, like a man being falsely accused. Your Honor, that boy's always been clumsy, always getting into scrapes. I did my best to care for him after Thomas died, but he's a difficult child. Disobedient, prone to running off. I may have had to discipline him a few times, but that's not the same as abuse. That's just proper parenting. Proper parenting doesn't leave bruises like that, Judge Morrison said coldly, and it doesn't result in a child collapsing from neglect at a train station. The boy ran away that day, Your Honor. I had no idea where he'd gone until these two, Garrick pointed at Weston and Marianne, decided to interfere. They took him without my permission, have been keeping him from me. If anyone's guilty of wrongdoing here, it's them. They saved his life, Marianne said, standing before she realized she was doing it. That boy was dying when I found him, dying because you worked him like an animal and fed him like a stray dog and beat him when he couldn't do enough to satisfy you. You don't want Eli because you love him or care about him. You want him because he's the key to the ranch, because without him you have no claim on Thomas Garrett's property. Mrs. Drury, Judge Morrison said warningly, but Marianne couldn't stop now. Thomas Garrett made his wishes clear. He wanted me to care for his son. He wanted Eli to have a real home, a real family, and that's what Weston and I are trying to give him. Maybe our marriage happened fast, maybe it's not conventional, but it's real, Your Honor, and it's 1,000 times better than anything Garrick Sloan would provide. The judge was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from Marianne to Weston to Eli to Garrick. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. I'm going to take a short recess, Judge Morrison finally said. I want to review these documents more carefully and consider everything I've heard. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. The next hour was the longest of Marianne's life. They waited outside under the merciless sun. Eli pressed between them, Weston's hand on the boy's shoulder like an anchor. Around them, townspeople gathered in small groups, whispering and speculating. Marianne could feel their eyes, could sense the judgment and curiosity. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked suspicious. And a few looked actively hostile, as if they resented outsiders coming in and disrupting the established order. Doc Morrison found them and offered a nod of encouragement. The storekeeper stopped by to squeeze Marianne's hand. But mostly they were alone. 3 people against the weight of law and custom, and a man who wouldn't go down without a fight. When they were finally called back inside, Judge Morrison looked even more tired than before. He waited for everyone to settle, then spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the crowded room. This is one of the more complicated cases I've seen in my years on the bench. We have a valid will that clearly expresses Thomas Garrett's wishes. We have evidence of neglect and abuse on the part of the current guardian. And we have a hasty but apparently legal marriage that changes the nature of the guardianship claim. After careful consideration, I've reached a decision. Marianne felt Weston's hand find hers, felt Eli press closer. This was it. Everything they'd fought for came down to this moment. It's clear to me that Garrick Sloan is unfit to serve as Eli Garrett's guardian. The evidence of abuse is compelling, and his behavior throughout these proceedings has done nothing to convince me he has the boy's best interests at heart. Therefore, I'm terminating his guardianship effective immediately. Marianne felt a surge of relief so powerful she almost collapsed, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. However, I'm also troubled by the circumstances of the marriage between Weston Drury and Marianne Locke. While I can't prove fraud, the timing is suspicious enough to give me pause. Therefore, I'm granting temporary guardianship to the Drurys for a period of 6 months. During that time, I'll be appointing someone to check on the household regularly and report back to me. If at the end of 6 months I'm satisfied that this is a genuine marriage and a suitable home for Eli, I'll grant permanent guardianship and allow the provisions of Thomas Garrett's will to be fully executed. If not, he paused meaningfully. If not, I'll have to reconsider the entire situation. It wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but it was enough. It was a chance. Marianne felt tears sliding down her cheeks as relief and residual fear warred inside her. "This is outrageous," Webb protested. "Your Honor, you're setting a dangerous precedent." "My decision is final, Mr. Webb. Mr. Sloan, you're to have no contact with Eli Garrett unless supervised by the Drurys or an officer of the court. If you violate that order, I'll have you arrested for contempt. Do you understand?" Garrick's face was purple with rage, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. For a moment, Marianne thought he might attack someone right there in the courtroom, but Webb grabbed his arm and pulled him back, whispering urgently in his ear. "Court is adjourned," Judge Morrison said, and brought down his gavel with finality. They made it outside before Eli started crying, huge, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. Weston picked him up like he weighed nothing, holding him while the boy clung to him and cried out years of fear and pain and desperate hope. Marianne wrapped her arms around both of them, and they stood there in the street, a makeshift family holding each other together while the town watched and whispered around them. "It's over," Eli kept saying between sobs. "It's really over. I don't have to go back." You never have to go back," Weston promised, his voice rough with emotion. "You're ours now, for keeps." But even as they celebrated their victory, even as relief flooded through her, Marianne caught sight of Garrick standing in the courthouse doorway. He was watching them with an expression of such pure hatred that she felt fear lance through her triumph. Webb was still talking to him, still trying to calm him down, but Garrick wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Eli with a look that promised this wasn't over, that 6 months was a long time, that the judge's ruling was just another obstacle to overcome. Weston saw it too. She felt him tense, felt his arms tighten protectively around Eli. "Let's go home," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." They rode back to the ranch in silence, exhausted and emotionally wrung out. Eli fell asleep in front of Weston, his head bobbing with the rhythm of the horse's gait, his face finally peaceful. And Marianne felt the full weight of what they'd done settling onto her shoulders. They had won the battle, but Doc Morrison's words kept echoing in her head. Winning in court might not be the end of this. It might just be the beginning of a different kind of fight. As the ranch came into view in the distance, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red, Marianne made herself a silent promise. They had 6 months to prove themselves, 6 months to turn this arrangement into something real and lasting, 6 months to become the family that Eli deserved and that she and Weston had claimed to be. And whatever Garrick Sloan tried in that time, whatever obstacles he threw in their path, they would face it together, because they weren't pretending anymore. Somewhere in the past week, between the fear and the fighting and the small moments of unexpected connection, they had stopped being strangers playing a part. They had become something more. They had become a family. And families, as Thomas Garrett had apparently believed, were worth fighting for, worth everything. The first week after the hearing passed in a strange kind of peace, like the calm that settles over the prairie before a storm. Eli transformed before their eyes, growing bolder each day, his laughter becoming more frequent, his nightmares less intense. He helped Weston with the morning chores without being asked, spent hours in the barn talking to the horses, and started calling Marianne Ma with an ease that made her heart swell every time she heard it. But beneath the surface of their daily routine, tension hummed like a plucked wire. They were all waiting for Garrick's next move, knowing it would come, but not knowing when or how. The court-appointed supervisor turned out to be Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, a widow in her 50s who ran the town's only boarding house and had a reputation for being fair but exacting. She arrived unannounced on the 8th day, driving a small buggy and carrying a notebook that she consulted with the seriousness of a general reviewing battle plans. "I'll be visiting once a week," she announced after Weston helped her down. "Sometimes announced, sometimes not. Judge Morrison wants a full report on the household, cleanliness, the child's well-being, evidence of a genuine marriage." She looked at Marianne and Weston with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I won't pretend this is a normal situation, but the judge believes you deserve a chance. Don't make him regret that decision." She spent 2 hours examining every corner of the house, asking Eli gentle questions about his daily routine, observing how the three of them interacted. Marianne felt like she was being dissected. Every gesture and word weighed for authenticity. When Mrs. Hastings finally left, she looked satisfied but not entirely convinced. "You keep doing what you're doing," she said. "The boy's clearly thriving, but I'll be watching for signs that this is just an act." Judge Morrison was right to be cautious. After she left, Marianne sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands. 6 months of this. 6 months of being examined and judged and questioned. "We can handle it," Weston said, but she heard the strain in his voice. They were living under a microscope, every action scrutinized, their entire future dependent on convincing a stranger that their hastily built family was real. The second incident came 2 weeks later. Marianne woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed and running before conscious thought caught up with her, screaming for Weston as she raced down the stairs. He emerged from his room at the same moment, already pulling on his boots, his face grim. "The barn," he said, and they ran together into the night. The fire was small, contained to a pile of hay near the back door, but it was deliberately set. They could see the kerosene can lying nearby, still reeking of fuel. Weston and Marianne worked frantically with buckets of water from the pump, managing to extinguish the flames before they spread to the rest of the structure. The horses were panicked but unharmed, and Eli, thank God, had slept through the whole thing. Standing in the smoky darkness, her nightgown soaked and her hands blistered, Marianne felt something inside her break. "This has to stop. We can't live like this, constantly waiting for the next attack." "I know." Weston's face was black with soot, his expression murderous in the moonlight. "I'll ride into town at first light. Get the sheriff out here. This is arson, attempted destruction of property. He can't ignore this." But Sheriff Coleman did ignore it, or as good as. He examined the evidence, made notes in his book, and offered the same tired explanation. "Unless you saw who set the fire, there's nothing I can do. Could have been anyone, drifters, someone with a grudge, kids playing with matches." "It was Garrick Sloan," Weston said through gritted teeth. "You know it. I know it. Everyone in this county knows it. Why won't you do something?" "Because knowing and proving are different things, Drury. You bring me evidence, a witness, something concrete, and I'll act. Until then, my hands are tied." Coleman looked genuinely regretful, but he rode away without doing anything useful. The attacks continued, escalating in their boldness. A week later, someone cut the rope on the well bucket, sending it crashing to the bottom. Then 3 of Weston's cattle were found dead in the north pasture, shot and left to rot. Each time, Sheriff Coleman came and made his notes and did nothing. Each time, Garrick had a perfect alibi. He'd been in town, or at the saloon, or visiting friends, always with witnesses who swore he'd never left their sight. "He's hiring people to do his dirty work," Weston said after the cattle incident. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, watching Eli play with the colt in the yard. "Probably paying drifters to cause trouble and move on before they can be questioned. It's smart, in a twisted way. He stays clean while we're slowly bled dry." Marianne felt exhaustion settling into her bones. In the 6 weeks since the hearing, they'd barely slept, taking turns staying awake to watch for trouble. The constant vigilance was wearing them down, making them short-tempered and anxious. Even Eli had started to regress, his nightmares returning, his laughter becoming less frequent. "Maybe we should leave," Marianne said quietly. "Take Eli and go somewhere Garrick can't find us. Start over somewhere else." "You know we can't do that. The judge's order requires us to stay here for the 6 months. If we run, we forfeit custody automatically." Weston reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them, a small comfort in the midst of chaos. We just have to outlast him. We have 4.5 months left. Surely he can't keep this up forever. But 3 days later, Mrs. Hastings arrived for one of her surprise visits and found the windows in Eli's room shattered, glass scattered across the floor and the bed. Someone had thrown rocks through them in the night, and they'd been so exhausted they hadn't even heard it happen. Mrs. Hastings' expression as she surveyed the damage was deeply troubled. "This is the third incident of vandalism in 6 weeks," she said, consulting her notes. "I'm concerned about the safety of the child. If you can't protect him—" "We're doing everything we can," Marianne protested. "These attacks aren't our fault." "Fault doesn't matter if the boy gets hurt. Judge Morrison's primary concern is Eli's well-being. If this continues, I'll have to recommend removing him from your care until the situation stabilizes." After she left, Weston put his fist through the wall of the kitchen, his control finally snapping. Marianne had never seen him lose his temper before, and the violence of it shocked her. He stood there breathing hard, blood dripping from his knuckles, his face twisted with frustration. "He's winning," Weston said. "Garrick's figured out that he doesn't have to hurt us directly. He just has to make it look like we can't provide a safe home. A few more incidents like this, and Mrs. Hastings will convince the judge to take Eli away. Then Garrick gets exactly what he wants, the boy and the ranch, and we'll have no legal recourse." "Then we need to catch him in the act," Marianne said. "We need proof that connects him to these attacks. Real proof, not just suspicions." "How? He's too smart to do the work himself, and anyone he hires will be long gone before we can identify them." Marianne thought hard, turning the problem over in her mind. They needed to draw Garrick out, needed to create a situation where he'd be forced to act personally rather than through intermediaries. And suddenly, she knew exactly how to do it. "What if we gave him what he wants," she said slowly, "or made him think we were giving it to him?" Weston looked at her, understanding dawning in his gray eyes. "You want to set a trap." "I want to give him an opportunity he can't resist. Let word get around town that we're overwhelmed, that we're considering giving up custody voluntarily. Make him think he's won. Then, when he comes to take Eli, we'll be ready." Weston's expression was fierce now, energized by having a plan, a way to fight back. "It's risky. If it goes wrong, we're no worse off than we are now. But if it works, we'll finally have the proof we need to end this." They spent the next 2 days carefully laying the groundwork. Weston went into town and made a show of asking about lawyers, mentioning loudly at the general store that the situation was becoming untenable, that maybe Eli would be better off in an orphanage than living under constant threat. Marianne visited the church and spoke tearfully to the pastor about her doubts, her fear that they'd made a terrible mistake. Within hours, the gossip had spread through Red Mesa like wildfire. The Drurys were giving up, admitting defeat, preparing to surrender custody. Mrs. Hastings made another visit, drawn by the rumors, and found what appeared to be a household in crisis. Marianne let her see the exhaustion, the strain, the barely controlled desperation. She didn't have to fake much. It was all real, just slightly exaggerated for effect. "I'm worried about you both," Mrs. Hastings said. "If you're truly considering voluntary surrender of custody, we should discuss the options. There are facilities in Tucson that could—" "We haven't decided anything yet," Weston interrupted. "We just need time to think, maybe a few days without interruptions or supervision." Mrs. Hastings frowned. "I'm not sure that's wise, given the circumstances." "Please," Marianne said, and she let real tears come. "We need space to make this decision as a family. We'll send word when we're ready to talk about next steps." Reluctantly, Mrs. Hastings agreed to give them a week before her next visit. After she left, Weston and Marianne prepared for what they both knew was coming. That night, they sent Eli to stay with Doc Morrison in town, telling him they had ranch business to handle and promising he'd be back home in a day or two. The boy protested. He'd grown clingy since the attack started, but eventually agreed when Weston promised he could help birth a foal that was expected any day. Then they waited. They made the house look empty, made it seem like they'd gone into town for the evening. But they were hidden in the barn, armed and alert, watching the house through gaps in the wooden walls. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Midnight came and went. 1 in the morning, 2. Marianne was starting to think their plan had failed, that Garrick was too cautious to take the bait when she saw movement near the house. 3 figures approached from the darkness, moving with purpose. 2 of them she didn't recognize, hired men probably, rough-looking drifters. But the third, hanging back slightly, was unmistakable even in the moonlight. Garrick Sloane had finally come to finish what he'd started. Marianne felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the moment that would either save them or destroy them. Beside her, Weston checked his rifle one more time, his face set in grim determination. The men reached the house and one of them kicked in the front door. They went inside and Marianne could hear them moving through the rooms, searching for Eli. When they realized the house was empty, angry voices carried through the night air. "Where are they?" That was Garrick's voice, thick with fury and frustration. "Maybe they really did leave town like the rumors said," one of the hired men replied. "No, they wouldn't leave without the boy. Check the barn." Weston and Marianne pressed deeper into the shadows as the 3 men approached. They had seconds to act, seconds to turn this confrontation to their advantage. As the men entered the barn, Weston stepped out with his rifle leveled. "That's far enough." The hired men froze, hands moving toward their weapons. But Weston's voice cut through the darkness again. "I wouldn't. Sheriff Coleman's riding up the road right now with 3 deputies. You draw those guns and you'll be shot before you can fire." It was a bluff. They hadn't told the sheriff about the plan, hadn't trusted him to keep it quiet, but the hired men didn't know that. They looked at each other, then at Garrick, clearly weighing their options. "This is private property," Weston continued. "You've broken into my house and you're trespassing in my barn. That's enough to get you arrested right there. But I'm guessing if we search you, we'll find tools that match the vandalism that's been happening here for weeks. Maybe even the rifle that killed my cattle." "You can't prove anything," Garrick said, but his voice had lost its confidence. He was realizing the trap had closed around him, that his caution had finally failed. "I can prove you're here, right now, with 2 armed men, breaking into my property in the middle of the night." Weston's voice was hard as iron. "And unlike the sheriff, Judge Morrison won't need much convincing about who's been behind all the attacks, especially when these 2, he gestured with his rifle toward the hired men, "start talking to save their own skins." "We ain't saying nothing," one of the men protested, but he looked nervous. Marianne stepped forward into the lamplight, and all 3 men started. "You have a choice," she said, addressing the hired men directly. "You can stay loyal to a man who's paying you to commit crimes, who'll let you take the fall while he walks away clean. Or you can tell the truth about who hired you, testify about the arson and the vandalism and the cattle killing, and maybe get some leniency from the judge." The 2 men looked at each other, having a silent conversation. Then the younger one spoke up. "He paid us $20 each to cause trouble. Said, make it look random. Said, don't get caught. Said if we did get caught, we should say we were just drifters passing through." "Shut up," Garrick snarled. "Shut your mouth right now or what?" the man shot back. "You'll kill us like you were planning to kill that kid? We signed on for property damage, Sloane. Nobody said nothing about hurting children." The confession hung in the night air, more damning than any evidence they could have gathered. Garrick's face went white, then red, as he realized what had just happened. He'd been caught, not through careful investigation, but through his own desperation and the disloyalty of the men he'd hired. "You'll never make it stick," he said, but his voice shook. "It's the word of 2 criminals against mine." "Actually," came a new voice from the doorway, "it's the word of 2 criminals, 2 law-abiding citizens, and a sheriff who's been gathering evidence against you for weeks." Sheriff Coleman stepped into the barn, and behind him were 3 deputies with their guns drawn. The sheriff looked tired but satisfied, like a man who'd finally gotten to do the right thing after too long doing nothing. "Been investigating you on the quiet, Sloane," Coleman said. "Couldn't act on suspicions, but I could follow up leads, talk to people. Found 3 more drifters you'd hired for other jobs. Got statements from all of them. Add that to what these 2 just confessed, and I've got enough to charge you with conspiracy, arson, destruction of property, and attempted kidnapping." "This is entrapment," Garrick spat. "They set me up." "Entrapment's when we make you commit a crime you wouldn't otherwise commit. You've been committing crimes against the Drurys for 2 months. All they did was give you an opportunity to hang yourself." Coleman gestured to his deputies. "Arrest all 3 of them. We'll sort out charges in the morning." As the deputies moved forward with handcuffs, Garrick's composure finally cracked completely. He lunged toward Weston with a roar of pure rage, his hands reaching for Weston's throat. But Weston was ready. He sidestepped smoothly and brought the rifle butt around in a controlled arc that caught Garrick in the stomach. The man went down hard, gasping for air, and 2 deputies were on him immediately, wrestling his arms behind his back. "You think this changes anything?" Garrick wheezed as they hauled him to his feet. "You think you've won? I'll be out in days. I'll appeal the custody decision. I'll make your lives hell until—" "No, you won't," Sheriff Coleman interrupted. "Judge Morrison takes a dim view of people who violate his orders and endanger children. You're looking at years, not days. And by the time you get out, that boy will be grown, and that ranch will belong to the Drurys free and clear. It's over, Sloan. You lost." They led the 3 men away, their voices fading into the distance as they were loaded into a wagon for transport to the town jail. And suddenly, the barn was quiet, except for the soft sounds of horses settling and Mary Ann's ragged breathing as the reality of what had just happened finally hit her. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Weston set down his rifle and pulled her into his arms, and Mary Ann collapsed against him, shaking with relief and leftover fear and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. She felt him trembling too, felt the tension draining out of both of them as they held each other in the lamplight. "Thank you," Weston said against her hair, "for the plan, for your courage, for everything." "We did it together," Mary Ann said. "That's what partners do." They stood there for a long time, holding each other as the night slowly gave way to dawn. And when the sun finally rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, they walked back to the house together, ready to start the next chapter of their lives. The following weeks brought a flurry of legal proceedings. Garrick Sloan was formally charged with multiple crimes and held without bail as a flight risk. His hired men testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences, providing detailed accounts of every act of vandalism and intimidation he'd ordered. The evidence was overwhelming, and even Garrick's lawyer, Webb, who'd seemed so confident during the custody hearing, advised him to take a plea deal rather than go to trial. Judge Morrison held a special hearing to review the new developments. Mrs. Hastings testified that despite the harassment, the Drurys had maintained a safe and loving home for Eli, that the boy was thriving under their care. Doc Morrison provided medical records showing Eli's dramatic improvement in health and well-being. Even the storekeeper spoke up, describing how the whole town had watched the Drurys fight for that boy's future against impossible odds. At the end of the hearing, Judge Morrison removed his spectacles and looked at Mary Ann and Weston with something that might have been approval. "I was skeptical of your marriage," he said. "I questioned your motives and your commitment, but you've proven me wrong. You've faced adversity that would have broken most couples, and you've come through it stronger. More importantly, you've given that boy a real home, not just shelter, but love and security and a future. Therefore, I'm granting permanent custody to Weston and Mary Ann Drury, effective immediately. The provisions of Thomas Garrett's will are hereby fully executed. The ranch and all its assets belong to you." Eli, sitting between them, let out a whoop of joy that made the whole courtroom laugh. And Mary Ann felt tears streaming down her face as the weight of 2 months of fear and fighting finally lifted from her shoulders. The ranch settled into a new rhythm as summer deepened and began its slow transition toward fall. The damage from Garrick's attacks was repaired. New windows, mended fences, the barn scrubbed clean of smoke stains. Weston and Mary Ann worked side by side, making the place not just functional, but beautiful, turning it into the home Thomas Garrett had envisioned when he'd written those letters months ago. Eli bloomed like a desert flower after rain. He grew 3 inches in 2 months, his frame filling out with regular meals and the absence of constant stress. His nightmares stopped entirely, replaced by dreams of horses and adventures. He started school in town that fall, making friends with an ease that amazed the adults who remembered the terrified, silent boy from the train station. And Mary Ann and Weston found themselves building something neither had expected, a real marriage. It happened slowly, in small moments, a hand held a little longer than necessary, a smile exchanged across the dinner table, the way Weston started leaving wildflowers on Mary Ann's pillow, the way Mary Ann began waiting up for him on the porch, 2 cups of coffee ready, just so they could talk in the evening quiet. One night in late August, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Weston took Marianne's hand and said, "I know we got married for practical reasons, to protect Eli, to satisfy the court. But somewhere along the way, those reasons stopped being enough." Marianne felt her heart speed up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I love you," Weston said simply. "Not because I have to. Not because we're legally bound, but because of who you are. Your courage, your kindness, the way you fought for a boy you'd never met. I love you, Marianne Drury, and I'd like this marriage to be real in every way, if you'd want that too." Marianne looked at this man who'd become her partner, her ally, her friend. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, leaving Philadelphia with hope and trepidation, finding disaster and heartbreak at that train station, discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed. She thought about Eli calling her ma without hesitation, about the ranch that was slowly becoming home, about the life they'd built from desperation and determination. "I love you too," she said, and the admission felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I think I have for weeks now. I just didn't know how to say it." Weston pulled her close and kissed her, and this kiss was nothing like the perfunctory brush of lips at their hasty wedding. This was passion and promise and the beginning of something they'd both been afraid to hope for. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Marianne saw Eli watching them from his bedroom window with the biggest smile she'd ever seen on his face. The 6-month review came in December, just as winter was beginning to settle over Red Mesa. Mrs. Hastings arrived for her final official visit and found a household that bore little resemblance to the tense, struggling one she'd first examined. The house glowed with warmth, literally from the fire crackling in the hearth, but also from something less tangible. Love, Marianne thought. The place was full of it. "I don't think I need to see much more," Mrs. Hastings said after an hour of observation. "It's clear this is a real family. That marriage of yours, whether it started as convenience or not, has become the genuine article. And that boy is happier than I've ever seen any child in my care." Her report to Judge Morrison was glowing, and the judge's final ruling came 2 weeks before Christmas. Full permanent custody granted. All legal challenges foreclosed. Eli Garrett was now legally Eli Drury, with all the rights and protections that came with being the adopted son of Weston and Marianne. They celebrated that night with a feast: roast chicken, fresh bread, apple pie made from fruit Marianne had preserved in the fall. Eli talked nonstop about the pony Weston had promised him for his 8th birthday, about school and his friends and all the plans he had for the future. And Marianne sat there listening to him, watching Weston's proud smile, feeling the warmth of home settling around her like a blanket. Later, after Eli had gone to bed, Marianne stood on the porch looking out at the winter stars. The landscape that had seemed so hostile and unforgiving when she'd first arrived now felt like a blessing. The harsh summer heat had taught her strength. The constant challenges had forged her into someone new, someone better, she thought, than the frightened woman who'd stepped off that train 6 months ago. Weston came out and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" "About how I came here expecting one life and found a completely different one. About how the best things that ever happened to me started with what felt like the worst day of my life." She turned in his arms to face him. "About how grateful I am that Eli tugged on my skirt that day at the station." "I'm grateful too," Weston said. "For that boy. For you. For the strange, unexpected family we've built." He paused, then smiled. "Thomas Garrett would have been happy, I think. This is what he wanted. Eli safe and loved, the ranch thriving, you finding a home here." "Do you think he knew?" Marianne wondered. "When he was writing those letters, do you think he somehow knew it would work out like this?" "I think he had faith," Weston said. "Faith that you'd care for his son. Faith that good people would do the right thing. Faith that love finds a way, even through the hardest circumstances." He kissed her forehead. He wasn't wrong. Inside they could hear Eli singing to himself as he settled into sleep, a happy, tuneless song about horses and adventures and home. And Marianne felt something that had been broken inside her for years finally heal. She had come west as a mail-order bride seeking security and companionship. She had found terror and hardship, and a battle she'd never imagined fighting. But she had also found love. Real, deep, hard-won love. She had found a son who called her Ma with trust and affection. She had found a husband who treated her as an equal partner, who valued her strength as much as her gentleness. She had found a home that was truly hers, earned through courage and determination rather than given as charity. The summer heat that had beaten down on them so mercilessly had eventually yielded to gentler seasons. The dust had settled. The battles had been fought and won. And in the amber light of winter evenings, with the cicadas long gone and the cold stars shining overhead, the Drury family had grown like wheat in summer, strong and golden and deeply rooted in the red earth of Red Mesa. Mary Ann had come seeking a new life. She had found it, though not at all in the way she'd expected, and she wouldn't have changed a single moment of the journey that had brought her here, to this porch, to this man, to this child, to this impossible, beautiful life that had grown from a desperate whisper at a train station. "Mama?" Eli's voice called from inside. "Can you come say goodnight again?" "Coming, sweetheart," Mary Ann called back, and she squeezed Weston's hand before heading inside. This was her family. This was her home. This was her life, messy and hard-won and absolutely perfectly hers. And as she climbed the stairs to tuck her son in one more time, to kiss his forehead and promise him sweet dreams, Mary Ann Drury knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The frontier didn't forgive the helpless, but it rewarded the stubborn. And stubborn she had been, stubborn they all had been, fighting for each other when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. They had won not through strength alone, but through something stronger, through love that chose to stay when everything said to run, through commitment that deepened with every challenge faced together, through faith that family was what you built, not just what you were born into. Outside, the winter wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of spring to come. And inside the warm house, 3 people who had been strangers mere months ago settled into sleep, safe and loved and home at last. The story that had begun with heat and dust and a child's desperate plea had ended with justice, love, and the kind of happiness that comes from surviving impossible odds together. It wasn't the story Mary Ann had expected to live when she'd boarded that train in Philadelphia. It was so much better.